By the end of 1976, 9 men were dead. Not because of a robbery, not because of an accident, not because of a war. They were dead because a deal was broken. A deal that was never written down, never witnessed, never officially acknowledged. In the Ozarks, in the mid-1970s, deals like this were common. They were sealed with handshakes, reputation, and memory. And for a while, this one worked. According to later accounts, the arrangement was simple. A shared operation, shared labor, shared risk, and most importantly, shared profit. No contracts were signed. No records were kept. Everyone involved believed the terms were clear. That belief lasted until the numbers stopped making sense. First, it looked like a delay. Then a miscalculation. Then something no one wanted to name, because naming it meant accusing someone. And in places like the Ozarks, accusation carries weight. What followed was not an immediate reaction. There was no confrontation, no public argument. Instead, there was waiting. Days passed, then weeks. Money that was expected did not arrive. Explanations were vague or missing entirely. According to people familiar with the situation, this was the moment everything could still have stopped. A conversation, a clarification, correction. But none of those happened. Instead, silence took over. And silence, in this case, did not calm the situation. It reshaped it. Because when a deal is broken and no one explains why, people stop thinking in terms of money. They start thinking in terms of respect, of position, of who can take and who must accept. By the time anyone realized the deal itself no longer mattered, the damage was already done. The agreement had become a test. And the outcome of that test would not be settled quietly. By the end of that year, 9 men were dead. Not all at once. Not in one place. Over a sequence of events no single person controlled, and no one could fully stop. This is not a story about greed. It is a story about what happens when informal rules replace formal ones, and then fail. About how waiting becomes weakness, how silence becomes alignment, and how a broken deal can escalate into something no one intended to create. This is the Ozark reckoning of 1976, and it began with a deal everyone thought was fair. In the mid-1970s, the Ozarks were not isolated by distance. They were isolated by habit. Small towns were close enough to reach in a day, but far enough to remain separate. People knew who belonged. They knew who didn't. And more importantly, they knew who could be trusted. According to regional accounts from that period, formal systems existed, but they were rarely the first option. Contracts were available. Courts were present. Law enforcement operated as expected. But those were last resorts. Daily life relied on something older. Reputation. In the Ozarks, reputation was cumulative. It was built over years of consistent behavior. Who paid on time. Who kept their word. Who didn't speak unnecessarily. Trust was not extended quickly, but once earned, it carried weight. That is why deals were rarely written down. Paper implied doubt. Doubt implied distance. A handshake meant something different. It meant the terms were understood without explanation. It meant neither side expected the other to need protection. According to people familiar with the region, most informal agreements worked precisely because they were never tested. They functioned as long as no one broke them. The economic context made this system necessary. Jobs were limited. Opportunities came and went. Seasonal work filled the gaps. People combined income streams, logging, transport, hunting leases, equipment sharing. Profit margins were not large, which meant fairness mattered. When several people worked the same operation, everyone needed to believe the division was honest. Not generous, honest. This created an unspoken rule. If you benefited from the group, you respected the group. Breaking that rule did not automatically lead to confrontation. It led to evaluation. People watched. They waited. They tried to understand whether what they were seeing was intentional or temporary. This was not weakness. It was caution, because confronting someone publicly carried consequences. Accusation, once spoken, could not be withdrawn. According to later recollections, This caution explains why early signs of imbalance were ignored or rationalized. A late payment could be explained. A missing amount could be a mistake. A vague explanation could still be acceptable. At least once. What mattered was pattern. In communities like this, pattern was everything. One irregularity meant nothing. Two suggested coincidence. Three began to form a conclusion. But conclusions were not announced. They were shared quietly. Men compared numbers privately. Conversations happened away from work sites. Questions were phrased carefully. Not "why did you take more?" but "did you notice something was off?" This is how awareness spread. Slowly. Without coordination. Without urgency. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. The operation continued. Work was done. Money still moved. But internally, trust was being recalculated. And once trust enters calculation, it no longer functions the same way. The Ozarks of the 1970s did not encourage immediate resolution. They encouraged endurance. People believed problems could be absorbed. That time would smooth them out. That patience would restore balance. This belief had worked before. Failed here. Because while patience delayed confrontation, it also delayed correction. And the longer correction was delayed, the more personal the imbalance became. By the time the problem was clear, it was no longer just about profit. It was about position, about who could take without explanation, about who would accept it. And once that question formed, the deal itself stopped being the issue. It became a symbol, not of money but of standing. The deal itself was not complicated. That was part of its appeal. According to later accounts, the operation was built around shared effort and shared risk. Each person involved brought something essential. No one was replaceable without consequence. One side controlled access to equipment. Another handled transport. Others provided labor, contacts, or local knowledge. The work was physical. The margins were narrow. But when everything ran smoothly, the outcome was predictable. Profit was divided according to contribution. Not equally, fairly. Those who invested more resources received a larger share. Those who invested time and labor received less, but still enough to justify participation. This structure was understood by everyone involved. It had been discussed openly at the beginning, not in writing, in conversation. According to people familiar with the arrangement, this was not unusual. Similar partnerships existed throughout the region, operating on trust and continuity rather than enforcement. The assumption was simple. If everyone benefited, no one had reason to cheat. At first, the numbers supported that assumption. Payments arrived on time. The amounts matched expectations. No one raised concerns. This initial success reinforced confidence. The deal was seen as proof that informal agreements still worked. That reputation still mattered. That paperwork was unnecessary between people who knew each other. That belief lasted until the first discrepancy appeared. It was small enough to ignore. According to recollections, one payment arrived late. Another was slightly lower than expected. The explanation offered was vague but plausible. Expenses had increased. Returns had dipped. Next time would be better. No one challenged this explanation, not because they accepted it fully, but because challenging it carried risk. Calling attention to imbalance meant questioning honesty. And once honesty was questioned, the deal could not continue unchanged. So people waited. They watched the next cycle. When the next payment arrived, the difference was clearer. Not dramatic, but consistent. According to those who noticed it, the numbers no longer aligned with previous patterns. At this point, suspicion began to replace assumption. Still, no one confronted anyone directly. Instead, information was gathered. People compared notes quietly. They asked indirect questions. They tried to determine whether everyone was seeing the same thing. This process took time. And during that time, the deal continued. Work was done. Profit was generated. But trust was being recalculated. What made this stage dangerous was not the missing money itself. It was the uncertainty. No one knew whether the imbalance was intentional. No one knew whether it would stop. No one knew how far it would go. According to later accounts, this uncertainty was interpreted differently by different people. Some believed the issue would resolve itself. Others believed it was already too late. But everyone agreed on one thing. The deal was no longer what it had been. It had shifted from cooperation to test. And tests demand responses. By the time the imbalance was undeniable, the opportunity for quiet correction had passed. Asking for clarification now would mean admitting the deal had failed. And admitting failure carried consequences. Not just financial, social, reputational. In environments governed by informal rules, reputation is currency. Losing it means losing access to work, to partnerships, to future opportunities. According to later reflections, this fear delayed action longer than it should have. People hoped the problem would stop on its own. It didn't. Instead, the imbalance hardened. And once it hardened, it became a signal. Not about money, about who could act without explanation, and who could not. That signal changed how everyone involved saw the deal, and each other. By the time anyone considered confronting the issue directly, the deal itself had already become secondary. What mattered now was standing. And standing, once challenged, is rarely restored through conversation alone. Waiting was not a pause. It was an action. According to later accounts, once the imbalance was recognized, everyone involved believed the same thing. That time would resolve it. Not through confrontation, through correction. Someone would notice the tension. Someone would adjust the numbers. Someone would explain. That belief shaped behavior. No one wanted to be the first to speak openly. Not because they were afraid, because speaking first meant defining the situation. And once defined, it could not be undefined. In the Ozarks, escalation carried memory. People remembered who accused whom, who forced issues into the open, who made private matters public. So people waited. They continued working. They accepted partial payments. They adjusted expectations quietly. This waiting was framed as patience. But patience had a cost. According to those familiar with the period, the longer the imbalance continued without explanation, the more it transformed in meaning. What began as a financial concern became a personal one, because accepting less without explanation implied acceptance of status. It implied that one side could decide outcomes without consultation. That implication mattered more than the money itself. During this phase, conversations changed. People stopped discussing solutions and started discussing interpretations. Not what happened, but what it meant. Each interpretation hardened positions. Some believed restraint preserved dignity. Others believed restraint signaled weakness. These views existed simultaneously, and because they were not reconciled, they split the group. Waiting created space for alignment. People gravitated toward those who shared their interpretation. Not through planning, through agreement, nods, silence, absence. According to later recollections, this was when the social map shifted. Not visibly, but decisively. Those who expected correction began to distance themselves from those who expected confrontation. Neutrality became difficult. Choosing not to speak was no longer neutral. It was interpreted as taking a side. At the same time, the person or group benefiting from the imbalance did not address it. Not publicly, not privately. Whether this silence was strategic or dismissive remains unclear. What mattered was how it was received. It confirmed the worst assumptions. By late summer, the waiting had changed everyone's calculus. People no longer asked, "Will this be fixed?" They asked, "What happens if it isn't?" That question shifted focus from resolution to consequence. Once people begin planning for consequence, resolution becomes less likely. According to accounts from the time, preparation began quietly. Not for violence, for separation. People adjusted routes, limited interactions, reduced dependence. These actions were defensive, but defensiveness, when mirrored, becomes provocation. Each side interpreted the other's distance as confirmation. By early autumn, the waiting had ended, without anyone announcing it. No one declared that patience was exhausted. It simply was. What replaced it was expectation, an understanding that the imbalance would not be corrected voluntarily, that any resolution would require force of outcome, if not force of action. This realization did not cause immediate escalation, caused readiness, and readiness, once widespread, creates momentum. By the time anyone considered speaking openly, the cost of doing so had risen. Explaining now would not restore trust. It would expose intent. And exposure at this stage carried risk no one was willing to take. The waiting had done its work. It had converted uncertainty into assumption, assumption into alignment, alignment into inevitability. The deal by now was irrelevant. What mattered was what would happen next. Polarization did not arrive as a decision. It arrived as a pattern. According to later accounts, once waiting ended, behavior changed across the group almost simultaneously. Not because of coordination, but because the same conclusions were reached independently. People stopped assuming neutrality. Every action was now interpreted. Where someone stood, who they spoke to, who they avoided. These details had always existed. Now they mattered. In small communities, polarization rarely announces itself. It becomes visible through absence, through who is no longer present where they once were. Shared spaces thinned out, conversations shortened, plans changed without explanation. According to those familiar with the period, this was when sides became identifiable, even if no one named them. One side believed the deal had been violated intentionally. The other believed the situation was being exaggerated. Both believed the other understood exactly what was happening. That mutual belief removed the need for clarification. Each side assumed intent, and assumed intent hardens positions faster than facts. At this stage, the conflict no longer depended on the original imbalance. Even if the numbers were corrected now, it would not resolve what had formed. Because the issue was no longer money. It was authority. Who had the right to decide outcomes? Who had to accept them? Who could act without explanation? Once those questions enter a group dynamic, compromise becomes difficult. According to later recollections, attempts at mediation were discussed, but never pursued. Not because mediation was impossible, because it required someone to ask for it. And asking for mediation implied uncertainty. Uncertainty in this phase was interpreted as weakness. As polarization deepened, people began protecting their position. Not aggressively, preemptively. They limited exposure. They shared information selectively. They prepared for outcomes they could not yet describe. These preparations were often defensive. But defense, when mirrored, creates escalation. Each side interpreted the other's caution as confirmation of threat. This feedback loop tightened. By mid-autumn of 1976, the social environment had changed completely. People who had once worked together no longer trusted shared assumptions. They no longer believed in correction through time. They believed in inevitability. And inevitability removes restraint. Not immediately, but steadily. According to accounts from the time, this was when small incidents began to carry disproportionate weight. A missed meeting, a delayed response, an unexpected presence. None of these were decisive on their own. Together, they reinforced the belief that the situation was beyond repair. By this point, no one believed the deal could be restored. The only remaining question was how the imbalance would be resolved. And that question did not have a peaceful answer. Because any peaceful resolution now required one side to concede status. And concession, once polarization sets in, is rarely chosen voluntarily. The Ozark reckoning did not begin with confrontation. It began with alignment. And alignment, once complete, creates its own momentum. By the end of this phase, everyone involved understood one thing, even if they never said it out loud. The situation was going to end. The only uncertainty was how much it would cost. The reckoning did not begin with a single act. It began with a shift in behavior that made conflict unavoidable. According to later accounts, once polarization had fully set in, routine interactions lost their neutrality. Places that had once been shared were now treated as conditional. Timing mattered. Presence mattered. Small deviations were no longer ignored. They were read as signals. At this stage, no one believed misunderstanding was possible. Every move was interpreted through the same conclusion. The other side knew exactly what it was doing. That belief removed hesitation. What followed unfolded as a sequence rather than an event. No plan, no declaration, no central figure directing outcomes. Actions occurred in response to expectations that had already hardened. According to available records and recollections, incidents were spaced out over time. Each one was treated as isolated by those outside the immediate circle. Inside it, they were understood as connected. This fragmentation mattered because it prevented early intervention, because it allowed escalation to continue without a single point of interruption. As events accumulated, involvement widened. People who had not been part of the original deal were drawn in through association, proximity, or obligation. Not because they wanted to escalate, but because neutrality had become impossible. According to later reflections, this was when control disappeared. No one felt responsible for the overall direction anymore. Everyone felt responsible for their immediate position. That distinction changed everything. Once responsibility narrows, consequences expand. By late 1976, the scale of what was happening could no longer be contained within the original dispute. The reckoning had become its own process, driven by momentum rather than intent. Accounts from the period emphasize confusion rather than clarity. No one describes a decisive moment. No one points to a single cause. Instead, they describe accumulation, one response triggering another, one assumption validating the next. By the end of the year, 9 men were dead. Not at once. Not as the result of one confrontation. Over a chain of events that no single person could fully trace, and no one could easily stop. Publicly, explanations were limited. According to records, incidents were addressed individually. Context was missing. Connections were unclear. This lack of a unified narrative allowed different interpretations to coexist. To some, it looked like coincidence. To others, inevitability. Inside the community, understanding depended on proximity. Those closest to the events recognized the pattern. Those further away did not. That distance mattered. It allowed the reckoning to conclude without a clear reckoning. No collective acknowledgement. No resolution. Only an end to the sequence. By the time the last incident occurred, the original deal was barely mentioned. It had been replaced by something else. A need to settle standing. A need to close uncertainty. A need to end a process that had taken on a life of its own. The reckoning did not restore balance. It only ended motion, and what remained afterward was not clarity, but silence. After the reckoning ended, there was no clear moment of resolution, no announcement, no collective explanation, no agreement that the process was over. According to public records, life in the Ozarks continued. Work resumed, businesses reopened, daily routines returned. From the outside, the region appeared unchanged. But inside the communities affected, behavior had shifted permanently. People moved differently. They avoided certain places. They adjusted schedules. They limited interactions that had once been casual. These changes were not discussed openly. They were understood. According to later accounts, trust networks that had existed for years were quietly dismantled. Some partnerships ended without explanation. Others continued, but only under stricter conditions. Informal agreements became rare, not because people no longer trusted each other, but because they no longer trusted ambiguity. Written terms replaced handshakes. Clear boundaries replaced assumption. The reckoning had exposed the cost of uncertainty. Over time, references to the original deal faded. Not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer needed explanation. Its consequences were visible in how people behaved, in who was trusted, in who was avoided, in which conversations never happened again. According to later reflections, the events of 1976 were rarely described in full. They were mentioned indirectly, as warnings, as examples. Don't let it get that far. The phrase did not require context. Everyone knew what it meant. Younger generations learned the story in fragments. Not as history but as caution. Details were withheld. The outcome was enough. By the early 1980s, the economic landscape had changed. Opportunities shifted. New partnerships formed under stricter rules. But the underlying lesson remained. Deals could still be made. Trust could still exist. But it had to be protected differently. There were no definitive conclusions. No single verdict. What it produced was adjustment. A recalibration of how agreements were made, how silence was interpreted, and how long patience could be afforded. This is what makes the story difficult to summarize. It was not about crime. It was not about a single decision. It was about process. About how informal systems function until they don't. About how waiting can feel responsible while making outcomes worse. And about how escalation often begins long before anyone realizes they are part of it. The deal that began the story was small. Its consequences were not. And once the process started, no one involved believed they were creating something permanent. They believed they were responding. That belief, more than the deal itself, shaped everything that followed. The Ozark reckoning of 1976 did not end with answers. It ended with silence. And that silence changed how people made deals, long after the deal itself was forgotten. In the next story, we'll examine another agreement that failed quietly, and the consequences that followed when no one intervened in time.